Welcome to the Oracle Enterprise Manager training series. My name is Yutaka Takatsu, one of the product managers in the Database Observability and Management product management team. This session is a recording of our November 2025 webinar on Oracle Real Application Testing, Best Practices and Deep Dive. We are pleased to have Alfredo, a Master Principal Cloud Architect, as our presenter today. Alfredo, please go ahead.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So I want to clarify a couple of things here. Maybe there's some confusion here about different tools and how they work, because we have a lot of interconnection between tools and management packs for the Oracle database. So I'm going to start with diagnostics and tuning. And the reason why I'm going to start with diagnostics and tuning is because that is the foundation for anything else about related to performance tuning. So using diagnostics pack, okay? Remember, when you enable the diagnostics pack, there's a lot of instrumentation happening at the database level. We're going to be using all that instrumentation because at the end, we need AWR data, right? So real application testing also uses this AWR data. So we're going to be using diagnostics pack. We're going to be using the tuning pack because the SQL training sets, the automatic SQL training sets, right, are part of the tuning pack. SQL performance management, which are all the baselines, and the automatic or the real-time SPM are part of the diagnostics pack. So as you can see, there's a lot of interconnection between diagnostics and tuning. Now, when you have your diagnostics pack and you have your data and you have your tuning pack, the next question is, Alfredo, how can I predict or validate the performance of my database? That is the use case that you have. You are migrating databases and you want to validate that the performance is going to be in check even before you do the migration. And that is what real application testing will come into play, okay? But again, real application testing, yes, has SQL Performance Analyzer and has database replay, but we're going to be going back and forth between different tools of the diagnostics and tuning packs and real application testing. So at the end, everything works together as a whole, okay? So I'm just gonna go real quick on this slide because there are different tools inside real application testing, but today we're gonna be testing and validate performance. So we're gonna show you the best practices on how you can test and validate performance, and also how you can replay your production workload on your test database. For that, we're going to be using two separate tools. We're going to be using SQL Performance Analyzer, and we're going to be using Database Replay, okay? So how that works. So what are the best practices here, Alfredo, for capturing my workload and be able to use these two tools in combination with the diagnostics and tuning pack? Because no matter what, we're going to be going back to the diagnostics and tuning packs at some point. So as a best practice, you should always execute SQL Performance Analyzer first before you go into Database Replay. And the reason why is because SQL Performance Analyzer will help you identify if you have SQL regression on your workload, right, before you try to run the replay. I don't know, we were trying to quantify last year the amount of customer requests that we had about database replay, and the amount of times the customers come back and say, Alfredo, I capture 60 minutes worth of workload for my production database, but when I replay that on my test database, it takes 5-6 hours. Why is that? The first question that we ask is, did you run SQL Performance Analyzer first? And 99% of the time, the answer is no. And again, 99% of the time, the reason why your replay is taking so much time compared to the capture is because you have SQL regression. So the best practice here is always execute SQL Performance Analyzer first, okay? Then once you understand if you have regression, The next step will be to actually fix that regression. How you can fix that regression? Well, we will go back to tools like SQL Training Advisor. So we're going to run SQL Training Advisor and get recommendations. Maybe we're going to get a recommendation about creating a baseline. Maybe we're going to get a recommendation about creating a SQL profile. Maybe we get recommendations about creating indexes or dropping indexes, or maybe rewriting the SQL, you name it, right? So there are multiple recommendations. But the main goal for SQL Performance Analyzer is to identify regressions, and then we will have to fix those regressions first before we go into database replay, okay? Then, once we fix those regressions, we can go ahead and execute database replay, okay? So that is the workflow. Like, this is the 360-degree view of the replay, right? We execute SQL Performance Analyzer first, and then we execute database replay. But Alfredo, tell me more about SQL Performance Analyzer. So what it is, how it works. So the first step in order to execute SQL Performance Analyzer is we need to have SQL statements. As the name implies, in SQL Performance Analyzer is very granular. We go to the SQL statement itself. So we need SQL training sets. So we will have to capture important workload from your production system into SQL training sets. So we're using a functionality of the SQL training pack, which is SQL training sets. We will have to capture SQLs there. All these best practices are detailed in this Majorca support note. And we recommend that in one SQL training set, we get a maximum of 5,000 statements, not more than that, because then it's difficult later to analyze that amount of SQLs coming from SQL Performance Analyzer. So we will create one or more SQL training sets holding those SQL statements from production. We will have to transport those SQL training sets to the test system. Then during the capture of the SQL training set, okay, we can filter out SQL statements. So what we want to do is remove noise. We don't want SQLs related to background processes like sys. We don't want backups. We don't want DBS and MP account, which is Enterprise Manager. We don't want the scheduler, things like that, right? So we want your actual application workload SQL statements into SQL training sets, okay? Then on your test system, we will also have to prepare the system for the replay, for SQL Performance Analyzer and the database replay. You will have to isolate that test system. We will have to disable all the maintenance windows. So we don't want background processes related to the gather stats process or backups or things like that in that database. We want the database not to have any SQLs running, interfering with this analysis. Then we will run SQL Performance Analyzer. We will identify regression. We will fix that regression, and then we will run database replay, okay? That is the overall process. And I have a workflow that explains all that process here. Before we go into that workflow and deep dive into each individual tool, which is SQL Performance Analyzer and database replay, okay, I want to highlight a couple of new enhancements, especially on the 24 AI version of Enterprise Manager. There are two ways to execute these tools. The first one is using the UI, which is Enterprise Manager. So you can log into Enterprise Manager and execute all these tools against your databases. And the second one is through SQL Plus. So you can just log in through SQL Plus and execute DBMS packages. And you can both execute SQL Performance Analyzer and database replay without Enterprise Manager, okay? So if you decide to use Enterprise Manager, especially for SQL Performance Analyzer, we have enhancements in 24 AI. So we modernize the UI. So if you compare 24 AI versus 13.5, you're going to find different look and feels, especially on the task and the trials, because now we're using Oracle Jet instead of HTML. We have new graphical charts, so we have better overview, so you can understand the data better. We have the same workflow that we have in 13.5, so that is not changing. It's just the UI that has a better look and feel. We have new charts. We have two different modes. We have the basic mode and the advanced mode in 24AI, right? So the basic mode is just minimal inputs, while the advanced mode allows for more flexibility, allows changes to configuration parameters. Because by default, when we execute SQL Performance Analyzer, we don't execute the full DML or your DMLs that we capture on the production database. There is a parameter that we need to modify on SQL Performance Analyzer to allow DMLs to be executed. In your case, when you say, Alfredo, I'm capturing my workload, I want to upgrade to 23AI, right? So I want the whole workload to be executed. I want to understand if I have regression, not only on select statements, but also on DML. We will have to enable this execute full DML parameter, okay? So continuing on the what's new here, we have the ability to generate reports on several metrics at the same time. So we're going to be generating reports. I have an environment here, so I'm going to show you those reports. We have an optimized workload for migration. We have also workflows for upgrades. And we have a workload that allows to execute any type of changes on your database, okay? So that's basically what we have new if you decide to use 24AI. When you have your enterprise manager on 24AI, you will get this new look and feel. But remember, you can use the UI or you can decide to use SQL Plus, no matter what, okay? So this is the quick overview of SQL Performance Analyzer. We capture SQLs. We transfer those SQLs to your test database. Then we create a baseline on your test database. We make a change on your database. In your case, the change is that you're going from 19C to 23I. We execute those SQLs on your 23 or your 26AI, now it's the new name of the database, and we compare the performance against the baseline that we created and then the SQLs being executed locally on the new database. We generate a report, we compare the performance, and the report gives you all those different changes, either SQLs that are changing, SQLs that are improving, and SQLs that are regressing. The ones that we worry about are SQLs that are regressing. If we get SQLs that are regressing, we will have to analyze those SQLs. We can either use SQL Plan baselines, or we can run SQL Training Advisor in order to get recommendations on how to fix that regression. But no matter what, we need to fix the regression first, okay? I have some screens here about, this is 13.5, so this is the SQL Performance Analyzer workflow. And as you can see, there are different workflows. We have upgrades, we have parameter changes, we have optimizer statistics change, we have the ability to ignore optimizer hints. We have customers moving from commodity hardware to Exadata, so there is an Exadata simulation workflow. And also there is a guided workflow that allows to execute any type of changes on the database, right? So this is how it looks like in 13.5. In 24AI, you see the look and feel is different. We have the same change type, so we can use parameter change, optimizer statistics, we can ignore optimizer hints, upgrade and migration. So if you select the upgrade one, then we can select, well, the basic one will just ask you for the execution method, what is the comparison, you submit, and the task will be there. If you select the advanced one, you have the ability to customize the pre-change trial, the post-change trial, and also the comparison configurations. In your case, my recommendation will be to go to the advanced one because you have more flexibility on deciding, well, maybe I want to modify my pre-change trial, and instead of using the data coming from my production database, maybe I want to execute SQLs here 2 times to see if they're changing or not. So you have more flexibility and control. But at the end, the process is a cyclical process because we're going to be running a pre-change trial on the database. Then we're going to be executing those SQLs again on 23AI. We're going to compare the performance. We're going to give you a report with all those different changes and variations. And if for whatever reason you have regression on SQL statements, SQLs are slower than the SQLs running on 19C, right? You will have to fix them. And if you fix them, either by creating a baseline or creating a profile or creating an index, that is a change to the database. So we will have to rerun the post-change trial after you make those changes. The main goal is that we rerun that process as many times as we need to the point that we don't have SQL regression. When we don't have SQL regression, that is when we stop. But we cannot continue to database replay if we still have regression. I have an example here of a report. So this is how a SQL Performance Analyzer report looks like, okay? So we have our SQL training sets. We have the SQL training set name. We have the owner. We have the number of SQL statements in the SQL training set. We have our SQL trials, which is my baseline and my execution. I can choose different comparison metrics, right? I can use buffer gets. I can use elapsed time. I can use read and writes. But at the end, okay, the one that is going to trump the rest of the metrics is elapsed time. And the reason why is because everyone is familiar with elapsed time. So maybe a SQL statement can change from 10,000 buffer gets to 9,000 buffer gets. But at the end, the question is, what does that mean for the execution time of the SQL? If the execution time is lower, then we're fine. If there's more execution time, then we have a problem. So we need to tackle that down. But when you get into the comparison metric of elapsed time, we're going to show you all the SQLs, the first trial, which is the baseline, the second trial, which is the execution. We give you all the improvements and regressions. You identify the SQLs that are regressing. In this case, you see the top SQL 6KD is regressing, is having a 62% regression, right? And the question is, Alfredo, do we have a new execution plan or not? If not, why do we have a different amount of workload? Something is happening with the configuration of the database. Or if we have a new SQL execution plan, we need to find out if the new plan is suboptimal compared to the original one. You can click on that SQL and you will get additional information about the rest of the metrics as well. So maybe we have a regression on elapsed time, but we have an improvement in buffer gets. But maybe we have an increase in IO reads. And remember, reading data from buffers compared to blocks from the IO subsystem is different. Going to the IO subsystem is always more slow than reading from memory. So that is where we need to get all the understanding and data. And at the end, when we identify SQLs that are having regression, we have recommendations on the same report. You can click Run SQL Training Advisor, or if we have SQLs that are changing, we can click also Create SQL Plan Baseline. So as you can see, we have integration with the SQL Training Pack and those SQL Training Pack tools in order to get recommendations on how to fix that regression. So in your production database, we capture SQLs inside SQL training set. That's the only thing that we do. Then we move those SQL training sets to your test database. You will run SQL Performance Analyzer on your test database, the database that is your destination database, where you're running all those testings on your destination Exadata infrastructure. On production, we only capture. We capture SQLs and we capture workload. That's the only thing that we do. Everything else is on your test database. So now that we're talking right now about SQL training sets, right? Everything that I mentioned so far is related to manual SQL training sets. So we will have to manually go to your production database, manually create a SQL training set. At the beginning, it's going to be empty. And then we will have to manually load SQLs inside the SQL training set. There are different options to load SQLs inside the SQL training set. So give me 1 second. I'm gonna bring my enterprise manager environment. So I will show you real quick. I'll go to databases. I'll go to sales. And this applies to 19C, 23AI, or 26AI. So when you go to performance and you go to SQL and you go to SQL training sets, let's say this is my production database, okay? So I'm gonna log into my production database. I will click create, and then I will have to specify a name for my SQL training set. So for example, demo. And I have the ability to create an empty SQL training set, or on the next step, I have the ability to load SQLs inside the SQL training set, okay? So we have different methods available for you to load SQLs inside the SQL training set. The first one is an incremental capture from your cursor cache. So remember, all your SQLs that are being executed in the database are first loaded inside the cursor cache. So if there are SQLs that are being executed on your database, they're gonna live inside the cursor cache. So what we can do is say, well, for example, if I want to capture 1 hour, I can ask Enterprise Manager for the next hour, right? Go every 5 minutes, check the cursor cache, and if you find SQLs, load them inside the SQL training set. If it finds the same SQL, right, it won't load the SQL many times. It will just load it once, right? And it will update the frequency that we're finding that SQL inside the cursor cache. But it's not like we're loading that SQL many times if we find it every 5 minutes. Only if we find, okay, new SQLs, new active SQLs, they're going to be loaded inside the SQL training set, okay? That is option number one. The second one is to say, I just want to load SQL statements one time only. So basically, I'm just going to go to the cursor cache only once, and everything that is there is going to be loaded inside the SQL training set. Another important one is to be able to use AWR baselines or snapshots. So if I select snapshot, okay, I have my AWR snapshots generated over time. I can select which snapshots I want to use, and I can load SQL statements from AWR, right? So that way I don't have to wait 1 hour. If I select snapshots and the period of time between the snapshots is 1 hour, then I will load 1 hour worth of data that already happened in the past using AWR snapshots, okay? So using these filter options that I have on the screen, this is where you have to filter things out, okay? So as a recommendation and best practice, I already covered that in the slide. You should select not in and, for example, add sys. You don't want to capture things from sys. You don't want to capture things from DBS and MP, right? Also, if you see the elapsed time in seconds, you can say, Alfredo, I want to capture only things that are higher than 1 second, for example. And you can select, there are so many filters here, fetches, executions, action modules. So for example, if I have a SQL text that I don't want to capture or a SQL ID that I don't want to capture, I can filter everything out from here, okay? So for example, in EBS, we only have the app schema. I can select in apps, and the rest is going to be excluded, right? Then you can schedule that. You can say, I want to run it right now. Maybe I want to run it tonight, 8 p.m. I can schedule that, and Enterprise Manager will run that for you, okay? So that way, we have the SQL training set created, and we'll have SQLs loaded inside that SQL training set. So for example, here, if I go to this pluggable database, I have this SQL training set. I have 62 SQLs. And if I click on the SQL training set, you see that we have the name, the SQL ID, text, planned hash value, parsing schema, and all the execution statistics. This is the data that we need in order to compare the execution and statistics between this database and when we run those SQLs on the 23AI version, okay? So now that we have that, we also have automatic SQL training sets. So everything that we did with SQL training sets was manual. There is a way to enable automatic SQL training sets. So the way that works is, I already covered the SQL cursor cache. But what we can enable is to have a background process, a background task, periodically checking for SQL statements. Okay. If we enable automatic SQL training sets, automatically we're going to have a SQL training set created. And over time, we're going to have SQLs being captured. For SQL Performance Analyzer for SPA, we don't recommend to use the SQLs in automatic SQL training set. However, for the real-time SPM or the SQL plan management or the SQL plan baselines, the automatic SQL training set is a must. Okay. So I just want to give you what is available. So we have the standard SQL training sets, the standard STS, and we also have the automatic SQL training sets. Okay. So again, they're critical for automation, especially on flavors like autonomous database. It's also available in Enterprise Edition. Over time, we're going to capture SQL statements automatically, right? So basically, we will have those SQLs inside this, the automatic SQL training set. It will purge SQLs automatically after 53 weeks. So the main goal is that the automatic SQL training set will capture those SQLs for us. There's going to be a SQL training set automatically created named sys underscore auto underscore STS, right? And all the content can be used, can be seen using the DBA SQL training SQL set underscore statements view, or you can use Enterprise Manager to see the sys auto STS. As you can see, the STS is created automatically. I don't have any SQLs because I don't have the automatic SQL training set functionality enabled on this database. But if you do, then you're going to have SQLs. The problem with that is that you have SQLs from a lot of period, a lot of history behind. And at the end, you want to control how many SQLs you want to capture for SPA. So again, the recommendation is to use the manual creation of the SQL training set specifically for SQL Performance Analyzer. For the real-time SPM, we recommend the automatic SQL training sets. Okay?
Sure.
So now let's get into a very interesting type of data here, which is the real application testing database flow. Okay? This is the replay flow. So as you can see, there are a lot of steps involved. It's not as easy as I capture and I replay. No, there's a lot of organized set of steps involved in this. So the first thing is to capture workload and to capture SQLs inside the STS. Okay, that is the first step. We will have to capture SQLs and we will have to capture workload from production. That is the only thing that we do on production. Then we set up the replay system. When we say we set up the replay system, there is a clone involved. Okay, so you will have to clone your production database to your replay system. You will also have to isolate the system. I as already mentioned, you won't need. You will have to disable all the maintenance windows and remove backups and background processes that will run on your replay system. Then you will execute SQL Performance Analyzer. We already covered that, right? So you must execute SQL Performance Analyzer first. So we execute a SPA. If we have regression, then we fix that regression, and we cannot pass over here unless we fix all the regression. Once we fix the regression, then we will run database replay. Database replay has several options, okay, to be executed. The first one is query-only mode, and that is the first replay that we will execute here. Query-only mode will only replay select statements, okay? We won't replay DMLs, just select statements. The first thing that we're gonna do when we go to database replay is to do a query-only mode replay, right? And the reason why is because we want to make sure that the select statements still behave. We don't have a big regression, but also we warm up the buffer cache on your database. We don't want the buffer cache to be empty and then have a lot of hard parses on the first database replay. That's the reason why we run a query-only mode replay first. If everything's fine, all the reports look fine, then we go to a short replay using the time mode. there are two parameters in order to replay the workload. The first one is time, and the other one is SCN. By default, the default one is time, and that is what we recommend our customers to run 95% of the time. Just use time. If on special circumstances, we know there are some workloads that won't behave properly with time. So we have the other parameter which is SCN. So we will have to run SCN if the replay using time doesn't perform correctly. Okay. So we will run the replay using time. We perform the replay. We identify and fix problems. And then we will define our replay baseline. What is the baseline? So when we run the replay, there are two types of validations that we will have to analyze. The first one is a functional validation. Is the data coming from my replay valid? Is something that I can use? So one example is the one that I was mentioning. If I capture 60 minutes and the replay takes 7 hours, is that replay valid? Of course not. We cannot use the data on that replay because it's not valid. It's not comparing apples to apples, right? So that is what I mean with we need to do like a functional validation. Is my replay on time? Is the comparison of transactions from the capture to the replay the same? Because if we are capturing 10,000 transactions on our production database, and we only replay 2,000, which is 20%, well, then it's not meaningful, right? We need to be able to, and we need to find out and verify in the reports that the amount of data that we're capturing is being replayed on the destination database, okay? And then once we validate and everything's fine, then we created our baseline. We know that the replay is valid and the data that is coming from the replay can be used for that. So we will have to replay once, but create a baseline. And this is where we can implement different changes. In your case, well, if you are upgrading to 23 AI, right, you can say, Alfredo, even before I upgrade to 23 AI, maybe I want to clone my database, my 19C database, to my destination system is still on 19C, right? I want to clone it exactly on the same version that I have my production database. And maybe I want to replay on 19C. And the reason why is because moving from one platform to another, so moving from 19C, I don't know if your 19C right now is on premises, but maybe you are going to Exadata, right? So that is a replatform. So you're moving from one platform to another platform. And you're also moving to 23i. That is another change. That is an upgrade. So maybe what you want to do is start peeling the onion and get the performance changes for each one of the steps. So maybe what you can do is, I have my 19C, I clone my 19C into Exadata, it's still 19C, and I run the replay. And I get the performance changes of the platform change. Then, when I create my baseline, I upgrade the database to 23AI, and then I run again SQL Performance Analyzer, and I run again database replay, and I get the replay results. Yes, I mean, the cloning of your database is manual. There are different ways to clone the database. So you can say, Alfredo, I want to use active duplicate. I want to use an Arman backup. I want to use a standby database and just open that standby database on the destination. I want to use transportable table spaces. I want to use data pump. Depending on the type of database that you're set up, you will choose the best cloning option for that. This is my production database. This is my SQL training set, and these are the SQLs that I loaded. You see that I have the lapse time in seconds per execution. We're going to be using this data against data of the SQLs because we're going to execute those SQLs in your destination database on the 23i. So we're going to capture those execution statistics when we execute those SQLs on that database, and we're going to compare those execution statistics against this data that I'm showing you on the screen. This data is coming from production. That's how we compare. Correct. And that is an important question and an important topic because you should decide when is the best time to capture workload in your production database. A lot of times customers say, I just want to capture 24 hours worth of workload from my production database. But the question that I always ask my customers is, what is the meaning and the implication of 24 hours? Don't think about time when you capture workload. Think about those business processes, the application processes that you're trying to replay. Because if I capture on Monday, but I have a mission critical process that only runs on Fridays, then I'm not going to capture that. And that is exactly right. So if you want to replay that mission critical process, then no matter what, you will have to capture from a Friday. Okay. So just saying, I'm going to capture 24 hours doesn't have any meaning. Saying, I'm going to capture from a period of time when I know that I have mission critical processes running on my database that I want to replay is what you want to do. So you will have to investigate when those mission critical processes run, right? And be able to capture them. You can say, well, maybe Alfredo, I'm going to end up with 2 or 3 different captures, and that's fine. The main goal is that you capture that meaningful workload from your production system. So let me go to the timeline here because this is very important. This topic is super, super important. So let's say we have from T0 to T8. And just to make things easier, let's say that we want to capture 4 hours of our workload in total. So I want to capture 4 hours of capture for database replay. So let's say from T4 to T8, we have 4 hours, okay? On T4, this is when I started the capture for database replay. This is when I executed the command or I click the button in Enterprise Manager. Please start the replay. So that is T4, okay? When the capture for database replays completes after T8, database replay generates a report. The capture generates a report. And that report includes a lot of information, includes transactions that were captured, sessions that were captured, but also includes the SCN number of the production database at the time of T4, at the time when I started the capture. So we have that SCN number. That SCN number is super important because when we clone our database from the production database to the destination, to the test database, okay, we're going to be using that SCN number. The test database needs to be at T4, okay? That is when we're going to clone our database. Once we finalize the cloning of my test database, it's going to be here at T4, okay? So my test database doesn't know anything about T5, T6, T7, T8. The test database is at T4. So again, that is super important. The next question is, Alfredo, well, this is for database replay. This is for the capture of the workload. But you're also asking me to capture SQL statements, okay? From what period of time are you asking me to capture the SQL statements? Still from T4 to T8? The problem is that if you start the STS capture from T4 to T8, right? And you capture a lot of SQLs during this period of time, okay? Remember, when you clone your database, your test database is at T4. Your test database doesn't know anything about T5, T6, T7, T8. That period of time hasn't happened yet, okay? So if you capture SQLs from T4 to T8, and then you use SQL Performance Analyzer to replay those SQLs, right? So for example, on T4, I have create customer number 2, query customer number 2, create order number 2, and query order number 2. But remember, that is on production. On my test database, I'm at T4. I don't know anything after T4. So if I run those SQLs on this database, the data is going to be misleading because I don't have that data. I don't have T5, T6, T7, T8. So the response times is going to be minimal. So the data that SPA is generating for me is going to be misleading. So Alfredo, then how do I fix that? The best practices and the recommendation is that you capture sequels from a period of time before T4. So now wait a minute, Alfredo. So are you telling me that I need to capture sequels before I capture for database replay? The answer is yes. So if you say, I want to capture 4 hours worth of workload for database replay. So what is the best practice here? Then the best practice is that you have to mirror or double that amount of time, those 4 hours, before T4. So what you will do is you will capture 4 hours of sequels, okay, from T0 to T4, let's say from 8 a.m., that is T0, right? From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11, and 12 p.m. T4 is 12 p.m. So first of all, you will capture sequels from that period of time. Then you will start capturing your workload from T4 to T5. The good thing is because we can capture from AWR, right? Just before we start the capture for database replay, we can create our SQL training set and ask Enterprise Manager or using SQL Plus to capture sequels from the AWR reports that were generated 4 hours before we want to start. Okay, so we don't have to wait 4 hours capturing sequels. We can capture them right away from AWR. Okay, but we just want to make sure that we're capturing 4 hours before we start the 4 hours for database replay. So now that we created the SQL training sets from T0 to T4, right? And then we capture our workload from T4 to T8, and we have the SCN number for T4. When we clone our database from the production database to the destination database using that SCN, I don't have to worry about that SQL training set because it's going to be already there. It was created before T4. So when I clone my database on T4, the SQL training set is going to be moved automatically. Okay?
Yes.
So now, after I clone the database, as a best practice, we recommend customers to enable flashback on that database. Create a guarantee restore point before you do anything to that database. Because we will have to flash back that test database many times during the testing phase. Cloning the database is expensive. Cloning the database takes time. If you enable flashback and we create guarantee restore points, we can flash back the database in minutes, and you save a lot of time re-cloning that database over and over again. So now that we have our database in T4, we can execute database replay. We can execute SQL Performance Analyzer. We already covered SQL Performance Analyzer. Here on database replay, we have different concepts compared to SQL Performance Analyzer. The first concept when we capture your workload from production is that the capture process will hear everything that the application servers are sending to your database server. So it's like sitting in the middle, listening to all that conversation between your application servers and your database servers. And it's going to start writing all those commands into something that we call capture files. So yes, we're going to capture the command that is being asked to be executed on the database. We're going to also write the timestamp of that request. We're going to write the SCN number of that request. We write a lot of information of that command that was asked the database server to be executed, okay? And we offload that data inside the capture files. One best practice and something to look for when you capture that workload from your production database, okay, is that for the capture, we're asking you to create a directory object, right? That directory object inside the database is pointing into a file system in the host, okay? That file system needs to be a fast file system. We have customers that have like a mission critical database. They have a lot of workload running, and they decide to use an NFS mount for those capture files. The problem with that is that NFS by nature is slow. It's not high performance disk. So when you enable the capture for database replay, there is an overhead to your production database. And the overhead is around 3% in total, right? So we're talking about 3% overhead just by enabling the capture. But the problem is that if you have a slow file system for those capture files, that can increase, right? Because the process cannot write to those files fast enough. So it's going to slow down your production database. And that is something that we don't want that to happen. So again, when you select that file system for the directory object, use either a local file system or a fast performance file system. There's another question here. Alfredo, how much data or how much capacity do I need in that file system? We have a Oracle support note that explains, we have a formula where we can estimate the amount of space that we're going to require on that file system, okay? So if you have concerns about the size of those capture files, we can help you finding that Oracle support note so you can calculate and approximate the amount of resources that the capacity of that file system that you're going to need, okay? So now that we have our capture, we have the SCN number of the capture, we're going to clone our database from production to the test database. Then we will have to run something that is pre-process the workload. We will have to process that workload on the test database. What is that, Alfredo? This process, what it does is it reads those capture files and creates metadata inside the test database. So basically, we're preparing that test database for the replay. Okay. The next step is to set up something that we call replay clients. So as you can see here on the screen, these are your application servers, right? These application servers are sending the transactions and the commands to be executed on the database server. Here, we don't need the application servers at all. These replay clients are mimicking your application servers. The replay clients are responsible of opening the capture files, reading that metadata that we generated through the pre-process of the capture files, and then sending those transactions to your database server, okay? So the replay clients are the ones that read the files and send those commands to the database server. The question here is, how do they send those commands? They send the commands based on what? Remember that I mentioned that during the capture, yes, we capture the command and the SQL and the session, but we also capture the timestamp of that request and we capture the SCN number of that request. By default, we use the time mode of the replay. Time mode means using that timestamp from the capture. That's how we release those commands to your test database, okay? Honoring that timestamp that when we listen to them, when we hear those commands coming from the application server to the database server, we're going to use that timestamp to release those transactions to the database server, okay? Again, that is the default mode. 95% of the times, that is enough for your workload. There are specific cases on workloads that are very transaction specific that time mode is not sufficient. So we can use the SCN number of the transaction also to release those commands. That's why we capture the timestamp and we capture the SCN number of the database, okay? Then we replay, then we generate reports, we analyze the reports, and then we proceed over. So now based on this, remember that I mentioned meaningful workload, right? But you can say, Alfredo, I have a process running on Monday and I have a process running on Friday, but maybe I have 3 different processes running on Wednesday. And I know that I need to capture, let's say, 12 hours on Wednesday in order to capture all of them. So you can create a capture on Wednesday for 12 hours. But later on, maybe your application team is asking you to replay only one of those processes. And they're telling you, remember that you captured 12 hours, that process only happens on the first 2 hours of your capture. So I don't want to replay the whole 12-hour thing. I just want to replay only 2 hours of that capture. We have a concept named subset. Okay, so you can subset your workload. After you capture, you can say, I want to create different chunks of this capture that I did. So you can create the first subset of the first 2 hours and only replay that subset of the workload, right? That is very important because it gives you a lot of flexibility on how much workload you want to capture or you want to replay, sorry. Another important concept is after you went through your baseline and you were able to successfully execute the event replay, you may say, Alfredo, I want to augment my workload. I want to stress the system I want to know if, for example, if I double the workload, if we're going to be able to sustain that workload with the capacity that I have. Or maybe I need to add more CPU, more memory, but I want to double the workload. I want to stress the system. If you have your 12-hour workload and you subset that in two, then you can replay those two chunks at the same time, for example. You divide that in two and you replay those two at the same time, so you're doubling the workload. All right? But that is more like advanced use cases after you went through the whole thing of replaying and making sure that everything's fine. Okay? So here what I did before this call was to capture from the sales database running on 1917 and I replay on 1918. I want to show you how the reports look like. So if I go here to quality management and I go to database replay, if I go to capture workloads and I go to this SOE capture and I show you the capture report. Let me zoom in. So here, as you can see, we have the start time of this capture. This is the SCN number that I'm mentioning over and over again. This is the SCN number that we need when we clone our database, okay? Here I just capture 5 minutes. Okay, just an example. This is the capture size. This is the number of megabytes on this capture. My directory. You can also filter workload. The same way that I show you how to filter from SQL training sets, you can also filter either in or out workload. You can exclude or you can include workload, okay? Because you don't want to capture workload from backend processes, all that. Just that is noise. You don't want to capture that. So you have filters that you can use as well, okay? Then we have all the workload statistics, database time in seconds, average usage sessions, user calls captured, right? The number of totals, this is 100% of this is my number of user calls, the number of transactions, session logins, all that. So I have my workload. Most of my workload is CPU bound is 14%. We have DB file sequential read 1%. And I have my top SQL that was captured, my top sessions that were captured. There are some restrictions about calls that we cannot replay. So if we have calls that we cannot replay because of these restrictions, they're going to be shown here, right? So for example, I didn't exclude background processes on this capture. And as you can see, the log file sync event, that is part of the background process of the database. This is when we switch from one log file to another one. We were not able to replay that. And you don't want to replay that. That is just background processes. That's why it's very important that you filter out things from SYS and DBS and MP, things that don't belong to your application workload, okay? So that is the replay report. And then if I go back here to database replay, I go to the replay tasks, and I go, for example, to this replay that I did, I can show you the database replay report. So this is my replay report where we have the capture and the replay. So my duration, I captured 9 minutes and my replay is taking 20 minutes, right? So that is something that we don't want to see. We don't want to see doubling the time. This demo environment only has one CPU assigned to the machine. So every single time I stress, it's going to take more time because everything is just very slow on this machine, right? But this is a very great example to show you how your DB time can jump really quick if you don't follow best practices. So if you get a replay like this, where the capture is 41 minutes worth of database time and you have 5 hours, the question is, Alfredo, is this valid? Can I use the statistics out of this replay for analyzing? The answer is no. I mean, this is not a valid replay. This is just a demo environment to show you things that you need to look for. This is the synchronization. This is the SEN. If it's enabled or disabled, this is disabled. That means that we're doing just a time default replay. We have the query only mode. Yes, so this is a query only replay, right? The number of replay clients, the number of user calls, and then we have something that we call divergence summary. Okay. If for whatever reason this divergence here is higher than 4 or 5%, then your replay is not valid. That means that you didn't clone the database properly. Why is that? Because, for example, if I have select statements with different number of rows fetched, let's say I'm fetching 1 million rows on the capture, but on my test database, because I didn't clone the database properly, or I didn't clone the database at all, I don't have 1 million rows. Maybe I just have 10,000. Then that difference is going to be here. And what is the problem with that is that you don't have the same amount of data, and for sure the select statement is going to be faster with less data. We want to have the same data set. That's the reason why it's really important to use that SCN number to have the data set properly. So if you have the data set properly and you have your accounts ready, same password, same everything, the divergence is going to be minimal. If you have issues with the data set, it's going to be shown over here. And again, if it's more than 4 or 5%, then your replay is not valid. You should not use the data in that replay to make assumptions or to make decisions on the performance of that replay. Okay. We also have the replay compare period report. The replay report will compare both the capture and the replay. It's going to give you performance statistics. It's going to give you information about ADDM, ASH data comparison. It's going to give you the wait time distribution, SQL statements. You see that I have one SQL that is regressing here, right? I have another one that is also regressing over here, right? So you can see the DB time and my long running SQL. So this is where we start getting into data and seeing, oh, I have one SQL that is not behaving. Maybe I have issues with log file sync and I need to fix that. Maybe I have NQs and I need to fix that. All that is going to be shown over here on this report. Okay. And last but not least, we have the AWR compare report. And as you can see, AWR is very comprehensive. I can drill down into every single statistic between the capture and the replay. I can see exactly how much data I'm reading. I can see exactly if the configuration of my destination database is properly set up, or I'm having issues and I have high wait times because of that. So everything is available for you for analysis. Okay. So I will go to database replay. I will create my replay task first. So it's going to be demo. I will have to specify the workloads that I want to select for that replay. So for example, I select one of my workloads, right? I select my workload. And then I will have to create a new replay. This is where, let me see if I can zoom in. This is where I will select a name for that. So it's going to be demo replay 1, for example. And I will select my destination database, my target database. This is where I want to run the replay. So I'm going to select my database 19C. Okay. And then I'm going to click submit. So what I did was just to create a task and select my destination database. Then it's going to generate this dashboard for me. This dashboard contains all those different steps that I mentioned. First of all, is set up the test database. This is to clone the production database to a test environment. This test database should be restored to match the capture database start of the capture, that SCN number. You can use Enterprise Manager to clone that database. So if you click here on Setup Test Database, it's going to open a wizard that is going to allow you to clone that database. If you already have your cloning process, can I clone my database externally without using this dashboard? Yes, absolutely. You can just skip this step if you can clone your database manually. But just remember that you need to use that SCN number. The next step is to isolate the test database. This is where we need to disable all the maintenance tasks and disable backups and all that. So if you click on that, it's going to open a workflow, a wizard that is going to help you disable all the maintenance tasks and disable backups on that test database, okay? Then the next step is to pre-process the workload. If I click on pre-process the workload, it's going to ask me for credentials. A credential I can select my sys credential and my Oracle credential. Then you select where you have your workload directory. I can click on retrieve workload information, right? And then I will click next and submit. The pre-process can take from 10, 15 minutes to like 2-3 hours, depending on the amount of workload that you have in your capture files. I already pre-processed that workload. So I already went through all this process and I click submit and the job completed. But I just want to show you how it looks like when you pre-process the workload, okay? After you pre-process the workload, the next step is to actually replay the workload. We can deploy replay clients, or we can use the same Oracle Home for the replay, and we will specify that through the replay workload. So for example, if I click here on replay workload, it's going to ask me for those credentials again. Okay, my sys credential. So I need to specify my sys credential and then my Oracle credential. Then I click next. I have my workload. I need to verify that that workload was pre-processed. So it was pre-processed on this 19.18. Okay, I click next. Then I need to map the connections. So what is the connection remapping functionality here? When I capture my workload from the sales database, this is the workload coming from the sales database, all the application servers were connecting to the database using a connect descriptor. All those connect descriptors are using the database name as sales. So that is the capture. My destination database maybe is not named sales. Maybe it's sales non-prod or NP sales, you name it. But if it's still sales, it's not running on the same server, right? It's running now on the Exadata destination database. So what I need to do is provide the connect descriptor of the destination database. Maybe I capture from this emccmarketplace.com, but maybe I have my destination on emcc non-prod marketplace.com. And maybe the port is not 1521 for non-production. Maybe it is. If it's the same port, it's fine. But maybe the SID is not the same. Maybe it's a different SID. So I need to specify the connect descriptor of the destination container database, okay? This is for the one running on Exadata. And then I will have to test the connection, verify that everything's work. I will click next. And these are the options, okay? The first option is synchronization. Again, I mentioned SCN and time. First, always use time. That is the default one. The first time, you always use time. Then on the first time, you don't mess with the connection or the connect time scale or the think time scale. That is more for advanced features like I want to release my workload faster or increase the workload. Just leave this connect time scale and think time scale the way they are. Leave the think time autocorrect the same way as true. And then on the first replay, you're going to enable query only mode. Okay, this is where you enable the query only mode parameter. That is your first replay. Okay, then you leave the defaults for PL SQL mode and SQL performance analyzer. Then you click next. Then you will have to set up the replay clients. So here on replay clients, let me give you, I'm going to write here on the screen, and I apologize, writing here with my mouse is not easy. So This is my production system. I have 2 application servers. Okay, and I have 1 database server here in the middle, and they're connecting here. So when I capture, database replay capture sits here and creates my capture files. Here on the destination non-production system, I have the database that I cloned using the SCN number, right? I have my database ready. But remember that I don't have application servers. So the question is, Alfredo, where does replay clients will sit, right? So I can have the host, my Exadata host where I have my database, and have my replay client sitting here, reading the files and sending those transactions to the database. Okay, that is option number 1. Option number 2 is that you can say, Alfredo, but that way I'm not measuring my network performance between the application servers and my database, right? Remember that I'm running on a different network now, right? And I also want to see if I can get some statistics about the network. So you can say, Alfredo, I have 2 hosts here, right? Empty, they don't have an application. I can grab the Oracle home of the database. I can clone that Oracle home here and here, and I can start my replay clients here. What are the benefits of starting the replay clients outside the database server? That these processes, the WRC processes, will connect through the network to my database. So when I go to my AWR statistics, now I can measure the performance throughput between the client and the server. But again, if you don't want to measure this, you can start the replay clients here from the original Oracle home of the database and just measure that performance without this network performance, okay? So here what I will do is, first I click estimate. The process is gonna read the metadata that we generated during the pre-process, right? And it's gonna say, Alfredo, the number of replay clients that you need is 1. That is depending on the amount of workload that you capture on the files. So I need only 1 replay client and I need 1 CPU cores on this machine, okay? It's like, okay, perfect. So I'm gonna click add and I'm gonna create 1 replay client. Here, I'm gonna select my host, which is my database host. I don't have any other host. If I had those extra hosts outside, then I will have to deploy an Oracle Enterprise Manager agent on that host. So I can select that host as well for the replay client, that external host that I mentioned, okay? I'm gonna select my credential. This is my connect descriptor from that host to the database, okay? So I want to be able to use that connect descriptor properly, right? In order to be able to connect to my destination database, okay? So for that, this is not correct. So I'm gonna select the proper connect descriptor here. Give me 1 second. And I'm gonna paste it here on the screen. So I'm gonna replace this one, okay? Then it's asking me for where do you have the Oracle client home? This is my Oracle home of the database. So I'm gonna select that one. And then I need to specify my client replay directory. So I will select my replay directory. This is where I have my capture files. I will use here a name credential. Here, I cannot use sys. I need to use a separate credential. So I'm gonna use system. For the rest of the tasks, everything's fine with sys. For the replay, I cannot use sys. I need to use a separate credential, okay? So I will click OK. So now I have my replay client created. I will click next and I will start my client. So basically the client is gonna be ready in order to send connections to the database, okay? So everything successfully is that everything's fine. I can proceed, I can click next, and then I can submit my replay. So right now I'm gonna submit that replay on my test database. So it's gonna take more than 10 minutes because it's 5 minutes plus all gathering statistics and all that. But that is the overall process of creating a replay using Enterprise Manager. All right?
Thank you, Alfredo. This concludes the recording of our webinar on Oracle Real Application Testing, Best Practices, and Deep Dive. Thank you for watching.